And now the Deeper Thinking podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live. If you found value in these conversations, if they resonate with your curiosity about life's deeper questions, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a review on iTunes. Your words help others find their way here and give us a warm, fuzzy feeling. Thank you.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. To step into solitude is not to abandon the world, but to recalibrate one's stance toward it. Withdrawal is not an escape, it is a refusal to participate in what no longer feels true. This refusal is not loud, it arrives slowly, as a quiet unravelling of interest in the rituals that once passed for connection. The conversations that once held shape begin to feel like mimicry. The laughter echoes strangely. And beneath it all emerges a subtle ache, not for isolation, but for coherence. Schopenhauer named this not as misanthropy, but as clarity. Those who step back do so not out of pride, but out of preservation. In solitude, the mind is no longer required to translate. It can settle into its own language. It begins to think in full sentences again. It regains its shape. And with that shape comes a quieter strength, not the strength to dominate, but the strength to remain unaltered. This is not easy. There is grief in this turning inward. The grief of knowing one will be misunderstood. The grief of no longer being mirrored. But there is also relief. The relief of being able to breathe without performing. Of no longer needing to convert oneself into a version that can be recognized. Solitude is not absence. It is presence without distortion. And in that presence, something sharper takes hold. Not isolation, but precision. Not detachment, but discernment. One begins to realize they do not need to be everywhere or with everyone. They need only be somewhere they are not required to fragment, and that place, more often than not, is found in quiet. There is a moment when the script slips, and the choreography of ordinary life reveals itself as performance. This moment is not always dramatic. It may come in a conversation that feels slightly too familiar, or in a laugh that rings just a little too late. And once glimpsed, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Schopenhauer did not frame this as cynicism. He framed it as awakening. To see the repetition in human interaction is to understand that much of what we call connection is rehearsal, gestures passed down, responses honed for acceptance, not for truth. Stepping back becomes not an act of superiority, but an instinct for something more substantial. This movement is not necessarily physical. It is an inward repositioning, a shift from seeking resonance in the crowd to cultivating it in stillness. It is a slow detachment from the need to be legible to others. And this detachment is not cold. It is fiercely warm in its commitment to truth. It refuses to adorn what is hollow. It ceases to chase the kind of intimacy that can only survive if one hides the parts of themselves that ask difficult questions. Solitude becomes the space where falseness is no longer necessary, where one can meet their own perception without having to dilute it for comfort. This is not retreat. It is a refusal to counterfeit clarity, and in that refusal, the mind regains integrity. It is not one cannot speak the language of social ritual. They often speak it fluently. It is that they begin to recognize its cost. The small daily misalignments required to belong, the gradual erosion of the unspoken self. Solitude, then, is the site of reassembly, not a place to disappear, but a place to return, so that when one re-emerges, it is not as a version, but as a presence. To dwell in solitude is to confront a kind of nakedness. Without the constant feedback of others, no mirrors, no nods, no curated warmth, the self becomes unfamiliar, then undeniable. Schopenhauer wrote of solitude not as luxury, but as crucible. It reveals not only what we are, but what we have been performing to avoid knowing. Without interruption, the mind begins to gather its own rhythm. It replays conversations not for regret, but for pattern. It listens not for noise, but for signal. And in that listening, it begins to unlearn. Unlearn the instinct to edit its own truths. Unlearn the need to soften perception for social survival. What emerges in its place is not purity, it is coherence. A kind of interior alignment that is not easy, but is unshakable, and with it comes a recalibration of value. One begins to prize attention over admiration, clarity over comfort, quiet over agreement. This does not mean a turning away from others. It means a turning towards something undivided. And in that shift, suffering changes shape. It is no longer the pain of not fitting. It becomes the ache of seeing clearly, the ache of recognizing impermanence where others see security, the ache of noticing repetition where others find novelty. Schopenhauer called this suffering unavoidable, but he also believed it could be transformative. For when one stops resisting this perception, it ceases to fracture the self. It begins to refine it, not into something smoother, but into something more exact. Solitude then becomes not a state to escape, but a threshold to cross, into a life where one does not need to be less awake in order to belong. Suffering, when seen through the lens of awareness, becomes less about pain and more about perception. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the subtle ache of noticing too much, the slight dissonance in a compliment, the echo of loneliness in a crowded room, the weight of beauty tempered by its fleetingness. Schopenhauer placed this suffering at the center of consciousness, not as punishment, but as consequence. To see clearly is to feel deeply, and to feel deeply is, in time, to suffer honestly. Those who carry this clarity do not suffer because they misunderstand the world. They suffer because they understand it too precisely. They see the recursive hunger of desire, the fragility of certainty, the way even joy carries the shape of its own vanishing. But this suffering, once endured without denial, becomes something else. It becomes a teacher, not of resignation, but of refinement. A person who no longer resists this sorrow begins to live differently. They stop chasing what fades. They stop arguing with impermanence. Instead, they start to build a life that can hold sorrow without being undone by it. Solitude is where this architecture begins. It is where one learns to suffer without spectacle, to grieve without narration, to stay with discomfort long enough that it reveals its intelligence. Schopenhauer did not promise release, but he offered a kind of dignity, a way of suffering that did not distort the self. Those shaped by this do not become bitter, they become careful, they speak more slowly, they offer fewer answers, they ask better questions, and in time they become a kind of quiet refuge, not only for themselves but for anyone else learning to live without illusions. Detachment, properly understood, is not indifference, it is precision. It is the decision to no longer let one's attention be held hostage by what is hollow. For Schopenhauer, this was not withdrawal from life, but reorientation within it. The world, as it is commonly performed, asks for allegiance to forms that do not nourish, social ritual over genuine presence, opinion over inquiry, ambition over stillness. Detachment begins when a person recognizes this trade and quietly refuses it. They do not disengage from care, they disengage from illusion. This refusal can look like distance, but what it creates is space. Space to listen inwardly, space to attend to what is not loud, space to rebuild value, not through reflection in others, but through internal coherence. And in that space, detachment ceases to be an act of retreat. It becomes an ethic, a way of living that is less about saying no to the world and more about saying yes to what does not disappear when no one else is watching. This ethic does not erase feeling, it deepens it. Love becomes less performative, more quiet. Curiosity becomes less reactive, more patient. Time begins to stretch, not because there is more of it, but because it is no longer wasted on repetition. Detachment, then, is not a posture. It is a calibration of attention, a refusal to let meaning be dictated externally. And though it may cost ease, it grants density. The person who chooses detachment is not running from life. They are refining it. They are refusing to live in ways that ask them to forget what they know. And in that refusal, solitude becomes not a wound, but a form of fidelity. Eventually, this fidelity to inner truth alters how one moves through the world. Those who have passed through solitude, not as visitors, but as participants, no longer require the world to mirror them back. The hunger for recognition, so central to performative living, dissolves. What remains is presence, untranslated, untheatrical, and whole. Schopenhauer saw this as the culmination of detachment, not numbness, but freedom from distortion. A life lived from within, not constantly revised in response to what surrounds it. This life is not loud. It does not seek validation. It does not present itself as wisdom, but it carries a stillness that reshapes the spaces it enters. The person who has endured solitude and chosen clarity does not become inaccessible. They become unshakable. They no longer rush to fill silences or to soften difficult truths. They have made peace with ambiguity, with slowness, with the partialness of all human understanding. And from this peace arises a different rhythm, one not shaped by urgency, but by attention. They move through life with fewer explanations, fewer performances, not because they have less to say, but because they've learned that not everything must be spoken to be real. In this way, the solitude they once protected becomes something they carry, not as isolation, but as a form of offering. A quiet permission for others to slow down, to be whole without display, to be honest without applause. Schopenhauer did not offer salvation, he offered stillness. And those who accept it find they need less from the world, not because they expect too much, but because they have found something more lasting, the ability to remain undivided even when surrounded. This is where solitude completes its transformation from condition to character. No longer a place one visits, it becomes the atmosphere through which one sees, chooses, lives. It is not an escape from relation, but a reframing of it. For Schopenhauer, the ultimate act was not in knowing more, but in needing less illusion to remain whole, to be able to stay present without being pulled apart, to listen without needing to be heard, to speak only when silence no longer carries the weight. This kind of solitude is not severance, it is stewardship. It teaches the self how to carry its own weight, and in doing so, it allows others to do the same. It does not demand understanding, it does not seek alignment, but it creates the conditions where truth becomes possible again, not truth as agreement, but as clarity held in tension. The one who has moved through this arc does not return to the world unchanged. They return without needing to be changed by it. Their presence becomes a quiet kind of resistance, not through opposition, but through refusal to betray what they have come to know. And what they know is this, that life lived without distortion is quieter, slower, and far more demanding. But it is also more durable, more luminous. And in that luminosity, others begin to recognize themselves, not the versions they have rehearsed, but the ones they have forgotten. This is the subtle gift of solitude rightly endured. It does not isolate, it clarifies, it does not reduce, it refines. And in a world trained to fear the quiet, the one who walks calmly within it becomes not a stranger, but a signal, a sign that depth is still possible, that coherence is not gone, it has simply grown quiet. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.